So you wanted to take a deep dive into the fall of East Germany, specifically looking for perspectives that challenge the usual narrative, right? Well, let me tell you, this excerpt from Sahra Wagenknecht's 1992 essay, it does exactly that.
Yeah.
It's a scorcher, even decades later.
It is. It is. What's so fascinating about Wagenknecht's perspective is that she flips the script on how we usually talk about the GDR. We often hear about its collapse as this inevitable outcome, a system destined to fail. But she argues that, particularly in its early years, East Germany was far more successful than many people realize.
So not the failed state narrative we often hear.
Not at all. Wagenknecht points to the period under Walter Ulbricht, the GDR's leader from the 1950s to the 60s. As a time of genuine achievement, it's a period often overshadowed by the later stagnation under Erich Honecker. But Wagenknecht argues that Ulbricht's economic policies, especially something called the New Economic System, or NO, offered a viable alternative to Western capitalism.
Oh, okay. You were curious about alternatives to the traditional Soviet economic model, right?
Yeah.
Well, this this is a great example. So imagine a system where instead of just taking orders from Moscow, East German businesses had more autonomy, were encouraged to be innovative, and even incorporated elements of a market economy.
And the key here is that, according to Wagenknecht, Ulbricht wasn't trying to abandon socialist principles. He believed these reforms would make the planned economy more efficient, more responsive to the needs of the people, ultimately strengthening socialism.
And did it work? Was the NOS as successful as Wagenknecht claims?
It's a complex issue, of course, but Wagenknecht presents compelling evidence that, at least for a time, the NOS did lead to significant economic growth and improved living standards in the GDR. She argues that there was a real sense of optimism, a belief that East Germany could not only compete with, but even surpass West Germany.
Wow, that's really different from the image we have of the later years. With the shortages and economic stagnation, Wagenknecht even highlights this concept of Störfreimachung, which essentially means disruption prevention. Basically, shielding the GDR from Western influence.
Yeah.
Almost like building a wall against ideas as much as anything physical.
This is a crucial point. Wagenknecht argues that Ulbricht understood that for East Germany to succeed, it needed to chart its own course, to develop its own model of socialism, free from outside interference, and Störfreimachung was a key part of that strategy.
It makes you wonder, what if things had continued on that trajectory?
Yeah.
What if Ulbricht hadn't been ousted in 1971?
That's a question Wagenknecht grapples with throughout the essay. She sees Ulbricht's removal and Honecker's rise to power as a turning point, a shift away from genuine socialist development and towards a more accommodationist stance with the West.
Accommodationist? You mean Honecker was more willing to play ball with the West?
Exactly. And a lot of this had to do with pressure from Moscow. This was the era of détente, a period of easing tensions between the Soviet Union and the West. But Wagenknecht argues that détente came at a steep price for the Eastern Bloc.
Okay, so for those of us who might need a little refresher, what exactly was détente?
Détente, which basically means relaxation in French, was this period in the 1970s where the U.S. and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies, tried to cool things down, think arms control treaties, increase trade, that sort of thing. On the surface, it seemed like a good thing, right? Less tension, less chance of nuclear annihilation.
Sounds good to me.
And it was, in some ways. But Wagenknecht argues that under the surface, détente masked a different reality. She believes that in their eagerness to maintain stability, the Soviets, particularly under Leonid Brezhnev's leadership, made a series of concessions that ultimately weakened the socialist bloc.
So instead of pushing their own agenda, they were constantly reacting to the West.
Precisely. And Wagenknecht sees this as a pattern throughout the Cold War. She argues that the Soviets, under Brezhnev, became too focused on maintaining the status quo, on avoiding conflict at all costs. And this, she believes, ultimately played right into the hands of the West.
So they were so afraid of rocking the boat that they ended up weakening their own position.
Yeah.
I can see how that might lead to problems down the line.
Exactly. And one of the most striking examples of this, according to Wagenknecht, is the Helsinki Accords. These agreements, signed in 1975, were hailed at the time as a major step towards peace and cooperation in Europe. They included things like respecting national borders and human rights. But Wagenknecht argues that these agreements also included concessions that ultimately undermined the socialist bloc.
What do you mean? What kind of concessions?
Well, for example, the Helsinki Accords recognized the post-World War II borders in Europe, which seemed like a win for the Soviet Union at the time. But Wagenknecht argues that by agreeing to this, the Soviets essentially legitimized the division of Germany and made it much harder to challenge the Western Bloc's influence in Eastern Europe.
So a short-term win for stability. but potentially a long-term loss for their ideological goals.
Exactly. And Wagenknecht argues that this desire for stability at all costs, this kind of appeasement, if you will, went even deeper. She's particularly critical of how the socialist bloc dealt with the legacy of Stalin.
Ah, yes. She calls this the Gegenstalinismus problem, right? But I have to admit, I wasn't quite clear on what she meant by that.
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Essentially, Gegenstalinismus translates to anti-Stalinism. Wagenknecht is pointing out that, while of course acknowledging and condemning the horrors of Stalinism was absolutely necessary, there was a tendency within the socialist movement to use it as a shield, a way to avoid confronting deeper, more uncomfortable questions.
So instead of really examining what went wrong, they just pointed the finger at Stalin and said, well, he was a monster, case closed.
Precisely. And Wagenknecht argues that this kind of intellectual laziness had real consequences. It created a void, she says, that was all too easily filled by reformist ideas. Ideas that she believes ultimately hasten the GDR's demise.
It sounds like she's saying that by focusing solely on Stalin's crimes, they missed an opportunity to have a more honest reckoning with the flaws of the system itself.
Exactly. And this circles back to the theme of continuity versus rupture. Wagenknecht is not arguing that Stalinism was a sound system. She's simply saying that its downfall doesn't automatically invalidate the core principles of socialism.
Okay, so it's not about defending Stalin, it's about learning from the mistakes of the past, even the really terrible ones, and using those lessons to build something better in the future.
Exactly. And that's where Wagenknecht's essay, for all its controversy, offers a really valuable challenge. It's a call to action, a plea to re-examine socialist principles in light of the failures of the past, not to abandon them altogether.
Which, let's be honest, is a pretty bold stance to take, especially given that she wrote this just a couple of years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The prevailing mood back then was capitalism won, end of story.
Absolutely. The early 1990s were a time of capitalist triumphalism, and in that context, Wagenknecht's essay was like a defiant cry in the wilderness. She refused to accept the end of history narrative. She was saying, hold on, we're not done here. There are still lessons to be learned, alternative paths to explore.
So what was Wagenknecht's alternative? What did she think a more authentic, more successful path for socialism could have looked like? It really is fascinating to think about. You know, we started by talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall, this very specific historical event. But Wagenknecht, she kind of pushes us to think much bigger, doesn't she?
Yeah.
It's not just about the past. She wants us to think about the future of the left.
Absolutely. And what's so striking is that she doesn't let anyone off the hook, not Western powers, not the Soviet leadership, and certainly not the left itself. She argues that the fall of the GDR and of the Soviet Union as a whole, it wasn't just a victory for capitalism, it was also a failure of the left to offer a compelling alternative.
She's saying, okay, that didn't work, now what?
But, and this is what I think is so interesting about her work, she doesn't just criticize, right? She doesn't just say, like, you messed up and leave it at that.
Yeah.
She actually outlines what a revitalized left could look like.
Exactly. She challenges the left to be more intellectually rigorous, to really grapple with the mistakes of the past and learn from them, instead of just distancing themselves from figures like Stalin.
It's like she's saying, it's not enough to just point fingers. You need to come up with a real vision for the future.
Precisely. Wagenknecht is calling for a move beyond simplistic binaries, beyond capitalism versus socialism, East versus West. She wants a more nuanced, critical examination of what a more just and equitable world could look like.
And what does that look like, according to Wagenknecht? For her, it's about a world where power and resources are distributed more equitably, where everyone's basic needs are met, where the needs of the many are prioritized over the profits of a few. It's a very humanist vision. And while she approaches it from a socialist perspective, it's something that resonates far beyond any one ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big vision. And honestly, I think it feels particularly relevant today, given the kinds of global challenges that we're facing, right?
Yeah.
Things like climate change, economic inequality. I mean, these issues, they require us to think beyond old divisions and come up with new solutions.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Wagenknecht's essay so valuable, even decades later. It challenges us to think critically about the world as it is and to imagine how it could be different. It's a call to action, not just for the left, but for anyone who believes a better world is possible.
It really makes you think. So to our listener out there, does Wagenknecht's take on East Germany resonate with you? Do you think there was another path, not just for the GDR, but for the socialist project as a whole? What lessons can we take from this history as we grapple with the complexities of our own time? We'd love to hear your thoughts.